When people think about the history of the United States, they often picture moments of triumph, independence declared, a constitution written, a nation expanding westward with confidence and ambition. But beneath those familiar images lies a deeper story, one that is harder to face and impossible to separate from the country's rise. From its earliest days, slavery was not a side chapter in American history. It was a foundation. It shaped how wealth was created, how power was distributed, how laws were written, and how ideas about race and freedom were defined. To understand the United States, we have to understand slavery, not only as a system of forced labor, but as a force that molded the nation's economy, politics, culture, and moral contradictions. Long before the United States existed as a country, slavery was already embedded in the colonies that would become it. In the early 1600s, European settlers arrived in North America seeking land, profit, and opportunity. They brought with them systems they already understood, including the buying and selling of human beings. At first, labor in the colonies came from many sources: indentured servants from Europe, enslaved Africans, and Native Americans forced into servitude. But over time, a racialized system of slavery hardened. Africans and their descendants were increasingly defined in law as property, not people, enslaved for life, and passed down from one generation to the next. This transformation was not accidental. It was driven by economics. The land of the Americas was vast, fertile, and ripe for cultivation, but it demanded labor on a massive scale. Tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, rice and indigo in the Carolinas, sugar in the Caribbean-connected economies, and later cotton across the Deep South all required intense, grueling work. Enslaved labor made these crops profitable. Plantation owners accumulated enormous wealth, while merchants, shipbuilders, insurers, and financiers in northern colonies also benefited from the trade in enslaved people and slave-produced goods. Slavery tied the colonies together into a single economic system, one that linked farms, ports, banks, and global markets. By the time of the American Revolution, slavery was woven into the fabric of colonial society. Enslaved people built roads, cleared forests, worked docks, cooked meals, and raised children for white families. They were everywhere, even as they were denied recognition as full human beings. The contradiction was obvious, especially as colonists began to speak passionately about liberty, natural rights, and freedom from tyranny. How could a society that proclaimed that all men were created equal continue to hold hundreds of thousands of people in bondage? Some Americans recognized the hypocrisy. Enslaved people themselves understood it most clearly. During the Revolutionary era, many enslaved men and women petitioned for freedom, ran away, or sought liberty by joining whichever side offered it, British or American. The revolution cracked open the door to anti-slavery sentiment in some places, particularly in the North, where gradual emancipation laws began to appear. But in the South, slavery only grew stronger. Independence did not weaken the institution. In many ways, it secured it. When the United States was founded, slavery was written into the nation's political framework, even when the word itself was carefully avoided. Compromises over representation and taxation counted enslaved people as fractions of a person, inflating the political power of slaveholding states without granting any rights to the enslaved. Federal laws protected slaveholders' property claims and required the return of people who escaped bondage. These decisions were not temporary oversights. They were deliberate choices made to preserve unity among states and protect economic interests tied to slavery. As the new nation expanded westward, slavery expanded with it. Each new territory raised the same explosive question: would slavery be allowed or prohibited? These debates were never only about morality, they were about power. Slave states feared losing influence in Congress if free states outnumbered them. Northern politicians worried about competition from slave labor and the growing dominance of Southern elites. Every compromise postponed a reckoning, but also deepened the divide. Economically, slavery fueled America's transformation into a global power. Cotton became the nation's most valuable export, feeding textile mills in the North and in Europe. By the early 19th century, enslaved people were producing the raw material that powered the Industrial Revolution on both sides of the Atlantic. American banks loaned money using enslaved people as collateral. Insurance companies wrote policies on enslaved lives. The wealth generated by slavery helped build cities, universities, and infrastructure that still exist today. Even Americans who never owned enslaved people often benefited indirectly from the system. Culturally, slavery shaped how Americans understood race, labor, and belonging. Pseudoscientific theories emerged to justify bondage, portraying black people as inferior, suited for servitude, or incapable of self-government. These ideas seeped into religion, education, and popular culture, reinforcing a racial hierarchy that outlived slavery itself. At the same time, enslaved people created their own rich cultural traditions, blending African languages, music, spirituality, and family structures under conditions of extreme violence and surveillance. Their resilience and creativity became an enduring part of American culture, even as their humanity was denied. Slavery was also a system of constant coercion. Violence was not incidental, it was essential. Whippings, family separations, sexual exploitation, and psychological terror enforced obedience. Laws criminalized literacy, movement, and assembly among enslaved people, while empowering slave patrols and militias to police black bodies. Fear shaped daily life for enslaved communities, but it also shaped white society. The fear of rebellion haunted slaveholders and lawmakers alike, influencing political decisions and hardening attitudes against any challenge to the institution. Resistance never stopped. Enslaved people resisted in quiet and overt ways, slowing work, breaking tools, maintaining secret traditions, escaping bondage, and occasionally rising up in armed revolt. Abolitionists, both black and white, amplified these acts of resistance, publishing narratives, organizing networks, and pressuring politicians. Their voices grew louder in the decades leading up to the Civil War, even as defenders of slavery became more aggressive in insisting that the institution was not a necessary evil, but a positive good. By the mid-19th century, the nation was straining under the weight of its contradictions. Slavery was no longer just a Southern institution, it was a national crisis. Every attempt to limit or expand it inflamed tensions. Courts, Congress, and the presidency were all drawn into the struggle. The question at the heart of it all was simple and explosive. Could a nation built on both freedom and slavery survive? The answer would come at a devastating cost. But even before the first shots of the Civil War were fired, slavery had already left an indelible mark on the United States. It had shaped who held power and who did not, who was considered a citizen and who was considered property, whose labor built wealth and whose lives were deemed expendable. The war would end slavery as a legal institution, but it would not erase its legacy. That legacy would continue to influence American life long after emancipation, in ways both visible and hidden. This is the story of how slavery shaped the United States, not only in its beginnings, but in its enduring struggles over equality, justice, and memory. And to understand where the nation is today, we must keep listening to this story, all the way through. As the United States moved deeper into the 19th century, slavery became more entrenched, more profitable, and more fiercely defended than ever before. This was not a fading institution clinging to the past. It was modern, adaptable, and deeply connected to global capitalism. Technological innovation, particularly the cotton gin, transformed slavery's scale and reach. What had once been a labor-intensive crop with limited profitability exploded into a massive industry. Cotton spread westward across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, carried by the forced migration of enslaved people in one of the largest internal population transfers in American history. This domestic slave trade shattered families and communities. Men, women, and children were sold away from their loved ones with no warning and no recourse. Slave pens and auction blocks became common sights in southern cities. Traders marched chained groups hundreds of miles south and west, turning human suffering into financial gain. For enslaved people, expansion did not mean opportunity. It meant exile, terror, and the constant threat of separation. Politically, the power of slaveholders grew alongside the cotton economy. A relatively small number of elite white men dominated Southern politics and wielded disproportionate influence at the national level. They shaped federal policy, blocked anti-slavery legislation, and demanded protections for their property. Over time, slavery ceased to be framed as a regrettable necessity and was instead openly celebrated by its defenders as the cornerstone of Southern society. They argued that slavery provided order, stability, and prosperity, and they cast any criticism as an attack on their way of life. In the North, attitudes towards slavery were complicated and often contradictory. Many white Northerners opposed the expansion of slavery while tolerating its existence where it already stood. Racism was widespread, and Black Americans in free states faced discrimination, segregation, and violence. Yet the presence of a growing free Black population and an increasingly vocal abolitionist movement kept the issue alive. Newspapers, lectures, pamphlets, and public debates forced Americans to confront the moral and political consequences of slavery. The law became one of slavery's strongest shields. Court decisions consistently favored slaveholders' rights over the freedom of enslaved people. Federal statutes compelled citizens in free states to participate in the capture and return of those who escaped bondage. This legal framework did more than protect slavery in the South. It nationalized the institution, making the entire country complicit in its maintenance. Even those who opposed slavery found themselves constrained by laws designed to preserve it. Religion played a powerful role in shaping public opinion. Pro-slavery ministers quoted scripture to justify bondage, arguing that slavery was divinely sanctioned and historically universal. At the same time, abolitionists drew on religious language to condemn slavery as a sin and a moral abomination. Churches split along sectional lines, mirroring the broader fractures in American society. Faith became both a weapon and a refuge in the struggle over slavery's meaning. For enslaved people, daily life was defined by control and resistance. Work began before sunrise and ended after dark. Punishment was arbitrary and severe. Families lived under constant threat of separation. Yet within these constraints, enslaved communities forged bonds of kinship and mutual support. They passed down stories, songs, and beliefs that affirmed their humanity and sustained hope. Enslaved preachers spoke of liberation and justice, often in coded language that slaveholders failed to fully grasp. Resistance was not rare, it was constant. Some enslaved people ran away alone or in small groups, risking death in pursuit of freedom. Others resisted by refusing to submit completely, asserting dignity in small but powerful ways. Organized rebellions, though less common due to the brutal reprisals they provoked, terrified slaveholding society. Each act of resistance challenged the idea that slavery was a natural or benevolent system. As tensions mounted, political compromises grew increasingly fragile. Each new law or agreement aimed to balance slave and free states, but balance became harder to maintain as the nation expanded. The question of slavery in the Western territories dominated national politics. Elections were decided on it. Parties formed and collapsed around it. Violence erupted not just in rhetoric, but on the ground as Americans fought over the future of the nation. By the 1850s, the possibility of peaceful resolution was slipping away. The language of debate hardened. Southerners spoke openly of secession if slavery were threatened. Northerners warned that the nation could not endure half enslaved and half free. Enslaved people watched these developments closely, knowing that the outcome would determine not only political power, but the fate of millions of lives. Slavery had shaped the United States into a nation divided against itself. It had driven economic growth while corroding democratic ideals. It had created immense wealth alongside unimaginable suffering, and it had forced Americans to confront a question they could no longer avoid: whether freedom and slavery could coexist in a republic that claimed to stand for liberty. The answer was approaching, carried on the winds of war. When the Civil War began, it was not immediately a war to end slavery, but slavery was its central cause. Secession documents, speeches, and declarations from Southern leaders made this clear. They feared the loss of political power and the potential destruction of a system that underpinned their economy and social order. The election of a president opposed to the expansion of slavery was enough to convince them that their future within the Union was no longer secure. War followed not from misunderstanding, but from irreconcilable visions of what the United States was and should be. In the early years of the conflict, the federal government moved cautiously. Leaders worried about alienating slaveholding states that remained loyal to the Union. Slavery was treated as a military and political problem, not yet a moral one, but enslaved people did not wait for permission. As Union armies advanced into the South, thousands fled plantations and sought refuge behind Union lines. They forced the issue, transforming themselves from property into actors in their own liberation. These self-emancipated men, women, and children reshaped the war. Union commanders had to decide what to do with them. Returning them to slavery undermined the moral legitimacy of the Union cause, while freeing them challenged existing laws and social norms. Gradually, policy shifted. Enslaved people were labeled contraband of war, then workers, and eventually soldiers. Their labor supported the Union war effort, and their presence pushed the nation toward a more radical understanding of the conflict. The decision to officially target slavery marked a turning point. Emancipation redefined the purpose of the war, turning it into a struggle not just for national unity, but for human freedom. It also transformed international opinion, discouraging foreign powers from supporting the Confederacy. For enslaved people, emancipation was a promise of freedom, but not an immediate reality. Many remained trapped in bondage until Union troops arrived. Freedom came unevenly, often amid chaos, violence, and uncertainty. Black soldiers played a crucial role in the war's outcome. Once allowed to enlist, they joined the Union Army in large numbers, fighting not only for the nation, but for their own liberation. Their service challenged deeply held assumptions about race, citizenship, and courage. They faced discrimination, lower pay, and brutal treatment if captured, yet they persisted. Their participation made it impossible to ignore the connection between the Union's survival and the destruction of slavery. As the war drew to a close, the United States confronted the enormous task of redefining itself. Slavery had been legally abolished, but its legacy was everywhere. Millions of formerly enslaved people emerged from bondage with little more than their freedom. They sought family members, built churches and schools, and asserted their rights as citizens. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the nation might reckon honestly with its past and build a more just future. That moment, however, was fragile. The end of the war did not end resistance to black freedom. Former slaveholders sought to maintain control through new laws and social practices. Violence and intimidation were used to suppress black political participation. The same fears that had once defended slavery now fueled efforts to undermine emancipation. Reconstruction became the next battleground. The question was no longer whether slavery would exist, but what freedom would mean. Would it include political power, economic opportunity, and legal equality, or would it be freedom in name only? The answers would determine whether the United States could move beyond the system that had shaped it for centuries, or whether slavery's influence would simply take new forms. The war had destroyed slavery as a legal institution, but it had not destroyed the beliefs and structures that supported it. Those would continue to shape American life in the decades to come, long after the cannons fell silent. Reconstruction began with extraordinary promise and deep uncertainty. The legal end of slavery forced the nation to confront questions it had long avoided. What did freedom actually mean for 4 million formerly enslaved people? Who counted as a citizen? And could a country built on racial hierarchy be rebuilt on principles of equality? For a brief period after the war, the federal government attempted to answer these questions in ways that fundamentally reshaped American law and politics. New constitutional amendments abolished slavery, defined citizenship, and promised equal protection under the law. These were revolutionary changes. For the first time, black men could vote, hold public office, and participate openly in political life. Across the South, formerly enslaved people organized conventions, joined political parties, and helped draft new state constitutions. Schools, churches, and mutual aid organizations flourished. Families torn apart by slavery searched for one another, asserting their right to marriage and kinship after generations of forced separation. This period revealed just how deeply slavery had shaped American society. The absence of enslaved labor upended Southern economies built around plantations and coerced work. Landowners struggled to adapt, while freed people sought independence through land ownership, wage labor, and education. The question of land was especially central. Without property or resources, freedom remained precarious. Yet widespread land redistribution never materialized, leaving many freed people dependent on former masters in new arrangements that often mirrored old power dynamics. White resistance to Reconstruction was immediate and fierce. Many Southern whites viewed black political participation as an existential threat. They responded with legal obstruction, economic pressure, and widespread violence. Paramilitary groups used terror to suppress black voters and intimidate allies. Lynching, beatings, and assassinations became tools of political control. Local authorities often refused to intervene, and federal enforcement was inconsistent and short-lived. Northern commitment to Reconstruction gradually weakened. Economic concerns, political fatigue, and persistent racism eroded support for federal intervention in the South. As attention shifted elsewhere, protections for black citizens were rolled back. Courts narrowed the reach of constitutional amendments. Federal troops withdrew. One by one, Southern states dismantled Reconstruction governments and restored white-dominated rule. What followed was not a return to slavery, but the creation of a new system built on its foundations. Segregation laws enforced racial separation in public life. Voting restrictions effectively disenfranchised black citizens. Labor arrangements like sharecropping trapped families in cycles of debt and dependence. Violence remained a constant threat. These systems were designed to preserve the social and economic order that slavery had created, even without legal ownership of human beings. The legacy of slavery was now embedded in law and custom. Racial inequality was no longer justified through explicit ownership, but through claims of tradition, order, and supposed social necessity. The language had changed, but the hierarchy remained. Slavery had taught the nation how to profit from inequality, how to rationalize exclusion, and how to enforce power through both law and violence. Those lessons were not forgotten. At the same time, Black Americans continued to resist and adapt. Communities built institutions that sustained culture, education, and political consciousness. Writers, activists, and educators challenged dominant narratives that portrayed slavery as benign or freedom as a mistake. Memory became a battleground. How slavery and its aftermath were remembered, taught, and commemorated shaped how future generations understood the nation's past. By the end of the 19th century, the promise of Reconstruction had largely collapsed. The United States had formally ended slavery, but it had not uprooted the systems of belief and power that slavery had created. Instead, those systems evolved, shaping the next chapter of American history. The consequences of slavery were no longer confined to plantations or battlefields. They were woven into everyday life, influencing who had opportunity, who had protection under the law, and whose voices were heard. Slavery had shaped the nation once again, this time through its absence, leaving behind structures that continued to define American society long after emancipation. As the 20th century began, the United States entered a period of rapid industrial growth and global ambition. But the legacy of slavery continued to shape who benefited from that progress and who was excluded from it. The nation presented itself as a modern democracy, yet millions of Black Americans lived under systems that echoed the control, exploitation, and racial hierarchy of slavery. Freedom existed on paper, but in daily life it was sharply limited by law, violence, and custom. In the South, segregation was enforced through a rigid racial order that governed nearly every aspect of life. Separate schools, transportation, housing, and public spaces reinforced the idea that Black Americans were second-class citizens. Voting rights, guaranteed by constitutional amendment, were stripped away through literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation. These measures were not hidden or accidental. They were openly defended as necessary to preserve social stability, using language strikingly similar to earlier defenses of slavery. Economically, the aftermath of slavery continued to dictate opportunity. Sharecropping and tenant farming replaced plantation slavery, but kept Black families bound to the land through debt and dependency. Contracts favored landowners, and mobility was limited. In both rural and urban settings, Black workers were often confined to the lowest-paying, most dangerous jobs. Labor exploitation did not disappear with emancipation. It adapted, maintaining racial inequality while fueling economic growth. In the North, the story was different but no less shaped by slavery's legacy. Millions of Black Americans migrated from the South in search of safety and opportunity, reshaping cities and industries. Yet they encountered discrimination in housing, employment, and education. Segregation followed them, enforced not always by law, but by policy, practice, and violence. Neighborhoods were divided, wealth accumulated unevenly. The patterns of inequality established under slavery re-emerged in new forms, embedded in urban landscapes and financial systems. Culturally, slavery's influence remained powerful. Popular media often romanticized the antebellum South, portraying slavery as a benign or civilizing institution. These narratives minimized brutality and erased enslaved people's resistance, reinforcing myths that justified racial inequality. At the same time, Black writers, artists, and intellectuals challenged these stories, reclaiming history and asserting pride, creativity, and humanity in the face of persistent dehumanization. The legal system continued to play a central role. Courts upheld segregation and limited federal efforts to protect Black citizens. Violence against Black communities was frequently ignored or excused. The message was clear: the state would not fully intervene to dismantle the racial order inherited from slavery. Justice remained uneven, shaped by assumptions about race that had been cultivated for centuries, yet resistance never vanished. Grassroots organizing, labor activism, and intellectual movements laid the groundwork for future change. Black churches, schools, and civic organizations became centers of political life and mutual support. Each generation carried forward lessons learned under slavery and its aftermath: the necessity of collective action, the importance of self-definition, and the belief that freedom demanded constant defense. By the early 20th century, slavery was no longer a visible institution, but it remained a powerful force in shaping American life. It influenced where people lived, how they worked, what they were taught, and how they were treated by the law. The nation had moved forward, but it had not moved on. The shadow of slavery stretched across modern America, shaping its contradictions and its struggles in ways that were impossible to ignore. The question was no longer whether slavery had shaped the United States. The question was whether the nation was willing to confront that reality and what it would do once it did. The contradictions created by slavery became impossible to ignore as the United States confronted crises at home and abroad. The nation spoke of democracy and freedom on the world stage, yet practiced exclusion and inequality within its own borders. These contradictions were not new. They were the direct inheritance of a society that had been built on unfree labor while proclaiming universal liberty. Slavery had trained the nation to live with moral inconsistency, and that habit endured. As the United States entered global conflicts, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, Black Americans were again called upon to serve a country that denied them full citizenship. They worked in factories, served in uniform, and contributed to national defense, even as segregation and discrimination remained firmly in place. Military service highlighted the gap between American ideals and American reality. Veterans returned home with heightened expectations and a sharper awareness of injustice, fueling demands for change. Economic policy further exposed the long reach of slavery's legacy. Government programs designed to build prosperity often excluded Black Americans or were administered in ways that reinforced segregation. Access to housing, education, and credit followed racial lines drawn long before emancipation. Wealth accumulated over generations for some families, while others were systematically denied the opportunity to build and pass down resources. The economic disparities rooted in slavery widened over time, becoming harder to dismantle as they solidified into structural inequality. Education reflected these patterns as well. Schools serving Black communities were underfunded and overcrowded, limiting opportunity and reinforcing cycles of disadvantage. Curricula often erased or distorted the history of slavery, presenting it as a regrettable but minor episode rather than a defining force. This selective memory allowed inequality to persist without challenge, teaching generations of Americans a version of history that avoided accountability. The criminal justice system also bore slavery's imprint. Laws and practices disproportionately targeted Black communities, echoing earlier systems of surveillance and control. Forced labor re-emerged through convict leasing and prison labor, linking punishment and profit in ways disturbingly reminiscent of bondage. Once again, Black bodies were exploited under the authority of the state, reinforcing the idea that freedom could be conditional and revocable. Yet even as these systems endured, pressure for change intensified. Activists challenged segregation, discrimination, and economic injustice, often at great personal risk. They drew on a long tradition of resistance that stretched back to slavery itself. The language of freedom, once denied to enslaved people, was reclaimed and redeployed to expose the nation's failures to live up to its own promises. The struggle was not only political, but cultural. Artists, musicians, writers, and filmmakers reshaped American identity, forcing audiences to confront stories that had long been marginalized. Through song, literature, and performance, they preserved memory and demanded recognition. Culture became a battleground where the legacy of slavery was contested and reinterpreted. By mid-century, the accumulated weight of these efforts began to crack the structures built in slavery's aftermath. Legal challenges, mass protests, and shifting public opinion signaled that the old order could no longer hold without constant repression. The United States stood at another crossroads, facing the question it had postponed since its founding, whether equality would finally be more than an aspiration. Slavery had shaped the nation's institutions so thoroughly that dismantling its legacy required more than laws or declarations. It required a transformation of values, power, and memory itself. And that transformation was far from complete. The mid-20th century marked a turning point, but not a clean break, in the story of slavery's influence on the United States. The civil rights movement forced the nation to confront injustices that had been carefully preserved since emancipation. Segregation, voter suppression, and racial violence were no longer regional issues or quiet practices. They were exposed to the world, revealing how deeply the legacy of slavery still shaped American democracy. Mass protests, boycotts, and legal challenges targeted the systems that had replaced slavery with segregation and exclusion. Activists demanded equal access to schools, public spaces, jobs, and the ballot box. Their arguments were rooted in the same promises the nation had made centuries earlier: liberty, equality, and justice under the law. What made this moment different was the scale of public attention and the willingness of ordinary people to place their bodies and lives on the line. Legal victories dismantled some of the most visible remnants of the post-slavery order. Segregation was declared unconstitutional. Barriers to voting were outlawed. Discrimination in employment and housing was formally condemned. These changes reshaped American law and expanded the meaning of citizenship. Yet they also revealed how much of slavery's legacy operated beyond written statutes, embedded in social practices, economic systems, and deeply held beliefs. Resistance did not disappear with reform. New political strategies emerged to slow or reverse progress. Appeals to law and order, states' rights, and tradition echoed earlier defenses of slavery and segregation, reframed for a modern audience. While the language shifted, the underlying concern remained the same: preserving existing power structures and resisting racial equality. Economic inequality proved especially persistent. While legal barriers fell, wealth disparities rooted in centuries of unpaid labor and exclusion remained largely untouched. Access to quality education, stable housing, and generational wealth continued to follow racial lines. The freedom promised after slavery had never included economic repair, and the consequences of that omission became increasingly visible. The criminal justice system expanded dramatically during this period, reshaping the relationship between the state and marginalized communities. Policing and incarceration grew as tools of social control, disproportionately affecting Black Americans. Once again, punishment and labor intersected, reinforcing patterns that had existed since slavery and its immediate aftermath. The form had changed, but the logic of surveillance and control endured. Culturally, the nation remained divided over how to remember slavery. Monuments, textbooks, and public narratives often celebrated figures who defended or benefited from the institution, while minimizing the experiences of the enslaved. Memory itself became a source of conflict. Whose history was honored, whose suffering was acknowledged, and whose voices were centered revealed how uncomfortable the nation remained with its past. At the same time, new generations continued to challenge silence and distortion. Scholars, activists, and artists worked to recover suppressed histories and connect past injustices to present conditions. They argued that slavery was not an isolated chapter, but a continuous influence, shaping patterns of inequality long after its formal end. By the late 20th century, the United States had outlawed the most explicit forms of racial discrimination, yet the structures built by slavery still influenced daily life. The nation had changed, but it had not fully transformed. The question of how deeply slavery had shaped the United States was no longer academic. It was visible in neighborhoods, classrooms, courtrooms, and workplaces across the country. The struggle to understand and address that legacy was ongoing, and its outcome remained uncertain as the United States entered the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The legacy of slavery became increasingly visible through patterns that could no longer be explained as coincidence or individual failure. Inequality mapped itself clearly along racial lines, tracing paths first carved by bondage, then reinforced by segregation, exclusion, and unequal policy. Slavery no longer existed in law, but its consequences lived on in systems that shaped opportunity from birth. Wealth became one of the clearest indicators. Generations of unpaid labor under slavery created enormous fortunes that were passed down, invested, and protected. At the same time, formerly enslaved people were freed without compensation, land, or meaningful economic support. That imbalance compounded over time. Access to home ownership, credit, and stable employment allowed some families to accumulate security and pass it on, while others were systematically locked out. The result was a racial wealth gap that reflected history more than effort. Housing policy played a critical role in this divide. Neighborhoods were shaped by decisions that rewarded some communities and starved others of investment. Property values, school funding, environmental safety, and access to services followed these lines. Where slavery once determined who lived where and under what conditions, modern policy often reproduced similar outcomes through different mechanisms. Geography became destiny, echoing an older system of control. Education followed the same pattern. Schools serving marginalized communities faced chronic underfunding, overcrowding, and limited resources. These disparities were not accidental. They were the result of long-standing choices about whose futures were worth investing in. The denial of education under slavery had been explicit and enforced. In the modern era, it persisted through neglect and inequality, shaping life chances in quieter but equally powerful ways. Public discourse often resisted connecting these conditions to slavery. Inequality was framed as a contemporary problem disconnected from history. This separation allowed the nation to avoid accountability. By treating slavery as distant and resolved, its ongoing effects could be dismissed or minimized. Memory became selective, focused on moments of progress while overlooking the systems that constrained it. At the same time, debates over identity, citizenship, and belonging intensified. Immigration, voting rights, and policing became flashpoints for deeper anxieties about who truly belonged in the nation. These debates echoed earlier fears that had shaped slavery and its defense, fears of losing power, control, and cultural dominance. The past spoke clearly through the present, even when unacknowledged. The justice system remained one of the most visible arenas where slavery's legacy endured. Disparities in arrest rates, sentencing, and incarceration reflected patterns of surveillance and punishment that stretched back to slave patrols and post-emancipation control. Prisons filled with those whose communities had been historically deprived of opportunity, reinforcing cycles of exclusion and marginalization. Yet alongside these realities, movements for reckoning and repair gained momentum. Scholars, journalists, and activists pushed for a fuller understanding of history, connecting the dots between slavery and modern inequality. Public conversations expanded to include questions once considered unthinkable about responsibility, restitution, and the meaning of justice across generations. These conversations were often met with resistance. Acknowledging slavery's enduring influence challenged cherished national myths about fairness, merit, and progress. It required confronting the idea that the nation's success was built not only on innovation and freedom, but on exploitation and coercion. For many, this reckoning felt destabilizing, threatening long-held beliefs about identity and history. Still, the discussion continued because the evidence was everywhere. Slavery had shaped where people lived, how wealth was distributed, whose voices were amplified, and whose lives were considered disposable. The past had not stayed in the past. It had been carried forward, reshaped, but not erased. The question facing the nation was no longer whether slavery mattered, but how honestly it would be faced, and what responsibility that understanding demanded. In the present, the persistence of slavery's influence has also shaped how Americans argue about history itself. The past is not just remembered, it is contested. What is taught in schools, what is commemorated in public spaces, and what is left unsaid all reveal ongoing struggles over meaning and responsibility. Slavery sits at the center of these conflicts because it challenges the most comforting versions of national identity. For generations, dominant narratives portrayed slavery as a regional problem confined to the South and resolved by the Civil War. This framing allowed the rest of the nation to distance itself from responsibility, but slavery was never only Southern, and its benefits were never limited to slaveholders alone. Northern industries, financial institutions, and political leaders were deeply entangled in the system. The wealth slavery produced flowed outward, shaping national development. Recognizing this reality disrupts the idea that slavery was an exception rather than a foundation. Public memory has often softened slavery's brutality. Textbooks once described enslaved people as workers rather than captives, plantations as communities rather than labor camps. Violence was minimized, resistance was downplayed, and enslavers were portrayed as paternal figures. These narratives did more than misinform. They normalized inequality by suggesting that slavery was less cruel, less central, and less relevant than it truly was. Challenges to these narratives have grown stronger in recent decades. Historians and educators have insisted on centering the voices and experiences of the enslaved. Their accounts reveal a system sustained by force, surveillance, and constant threat, but also by extraordinary resilience and resistance. By telling these stories, the nation is forced to confront not only what slavery was, but what it required Americans to become in order to maintain it. The debate over monuments and symbols reflects this struggle. Statues honoring figures who defended slavery or segregation raise questions about whose values are celebrated and whose suffering is ignored. These conflicts are not about erasing history. They are about deciding which histories are honored and which are marginalized. Slavery's legacy lives on in stone and bronze, shaping public space and collective memory. Language itself carries the imprint of slavery. Ideas about criminality, deservingness, and worth have been shaped by centuries of racialized thinking. Even when stripped of explicit references to race, these concepts continue to influence policy and perception. Slavery trained Americans to associate blackness with danger, dependency, or inferiority. Undoing those associations requires more than legal reform. It requires cultural transformation. The economy, too, reflects inherited patterns. Labor is still valued differently depending on who performs it. Certain forms of work remain undervalued and underpaid, often filled by those descended from communities once enslaved or excluded. This hierarchy echoes slavery's fundamental lesson that some labor could be extracted without full recognition of humanity. Though the system has changed, the mindset persists. At the same time, the United States has repeatedly demonstrated its capacity for reinvention. Social movements have expanded rights, reshaped laws, and altered public consciousness. Each generation has pushed the boundaries of freedom further than the last, often by confronting truths earlier generations refused to face. Slavery's legacy has not gone unchallenged. It has been resisted, debated, and reinterpreted again and again. Still, progress has never been linear. Advances have often been followed by backlash. Gains have been met with retrenchment. This pattern reflects the unresolved tension at the heart of the nation, a tension born in slavery, the desire for freedom alongside the desire to preserve hierarchy. That tension continues to shape political conflict and social division. Understanding how slavery shaped the United States requires acknowledging this continuity. It means recognizing that the past is not a closed chapter, but a force that informs the present. Slavery did not simply end. It transformed, leaving behind structures, beliefs, and inequalities that continue to influence American life. Facing that reality does not weaken the nation's story, it deepens it. It replaces myth with complexity, denial with understanding. And it opens the possibility that by fully confronting how slavery shaped the United States, the nation might finally begin to shape something different. In its place, the influence of slavery can also be seen in how the United States understands freedom itself. From the beginning, freedom was defined in contrast to enslavement. To be free was to not be enslaved, and that distinction shaped political thought, social norms, and economic expectations. But because freedom was built alongside bondage, it was never distributed equally. Some freedoms were expansive and protected, while others were fragile, conditional, or denied altogether. This uneven understanding of freedom shaped labor in America long after slavery ended. Work was celebrated as a path to dignity and independence, yet entire categories of labor were excluded from protections and recognition. Domestic work, agricultural labor, and other physically demanding jobs, many of them filled by black workers after emancipation, were often left out of labor reforms. These exclusions were not accidental. They reflected the lingering assumption that certain kinds of labor and certain kinds of workers did not deserve the same rights. Slavery also influenced how Americans understood punishment and discipline. Under slavery, violence was normalized as a tool of control. The authority to punish was embedded in law and culture, granting some people power over the bodies of others. After emancipation, this logic did not disappear. It was transferred into new institutions, shaping policing practices, sentencing laws, and attitudes toward incarceration. The idea that order required harsh control remained deeply ingrained. Political participation followed similar patterns. The expansion of democracy in the United States was always selective, often reactive, and frequently contested. When Black Americans asserted political power, it was often framed as disorder or corruption. These reactions echoed earlier fears of enslaved people's autonomy and collective action. Slavery had taught generations to associate Black political agency with chaos, a belief that continued to influence public discourse. Even concepts of property and ownership were shaped by slavery's legacy. For centuries, human beings were treated as assets, bought, sold, and insured. This distorted relationship between people and property left lasting marks on legal thinking. Rights were often prioritized over responsibilities. Ownership was elevated over human well-being. These values influenced everything from housing policy to corporate governance, reinforcing systems that privileged accumulation over equity. The emotional and psychological impact of slavery also endured across generations. Trauma did not end with emancipation. The constant threat of violence, family separation, and dehumanization left scars that were carried forward through stories, silences, and survival strategies. At the same time, resilience, creativity, and collective strength were passed down as well. Slavery shaped not only suffering, but the ways communities learned to endure and resist it. National identity was built around selective memory. Celebrations of freedom often excluded those for whom freedom arrived late or incompletely. Holidays, symbols, and myths emphasized unity while avoiding conflict. This selective remembrance made it easier to celebrate progress without reckoning with cost. Slavery's victims were rarely centered in the nation's most cherished stories, reinforcing the idea that their experiences were peripheral rather than foundational. When moments of crisis emerged, these unresolved histories resurfaced. Economic downturns, social unrest, and political polarization exposed underlying inequalities that traced back to slavery. Each time, debates returned to familiar questions about responsibility, fairness, and belonging. Who deserved help? Who was blamed for instability? Who was considered fully American? The answers often followed patterns established long ago. Yet history also shows that change is possible. The same nation that built and defended slavery also produced movements that challenged it. The struggle against slavery forged traditions of resistance, moral argument, and collective action that continue to inspire efforts toward justice. These traditions are part of the American inheritance as much as slavery itself. Understanding how slavery shaped the United States means holding these truths together. It means acknowledging the depth of harm without denying the capacity for change. It means recognizing that the past is not something to escape, but something to understand so that its patterns are not endlessly repeated. The story does not end with acknowledgement. It continues in the choices the nation makes about memory, policy, and justice. Slavery shaped the United States, but it does not have to define its future. The question of responsibility sits at the heart of how slavery continues to shape the United States. Responsibility is uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that history is neutral or that its consequences are evenly shared. Slavery was not an abstract force. It was a system built and maintained through choices made by governments, institutions, and individuals. Its benefits were accumulated, protected, and passed down. Its harms were concentrated, enforced, and inherited. Recognizing this disrupts the belief that the present is detached from the past. This tension is visible in debates about accountability and repair. When people argue that slavery happened too long ago to matter, they are often measuring time without measuring impact. The effects of slavery did not stop in 1865. They were carried forward through law, policy, and practice, shaping access to land, education, safety, and political power. These were not natural outcomes. They were the result of decisions made after slavery ended, decisions that allowed inequality to harden rather than heal. Institutions played a major role in this process. Governments at every level enforced rules that limited black advancement while protecting white advantage. Banks denied loans. Schools were segregated and underfunded. Courts looked away from violence. Each of these actions extended slavery's logic into the future, translating ownership into exclusion, bondage into marginalization. Responsibility, therefore, is not only about the past. It is about how the past was managed, ignored, or reinforced. The idea of merit has also been shaped by slavery's legacy. Success is often framed as the result of individual effort, while failure is attributed to personal shortcomings. This narrative overlooks the accumulated advantages created by generations of unpaid labor and unequal access. Slavery distorted the starting line, and its aftermath ensured that the race was never fair. Ignoring this reality allows inequality to be explained away rather than addressed. Public policy debates reflect this divide. Discussions about welfare, taxation, education, and criminal justice are often framed in moral terms that echo older judgments about deservingness and discipline. Slavery taught the nation to sort people into categories of worth, to justify unequal treatment as necessary or natural. Those habits of thought persist, shaping how problems are defined and which solutions are considered acceptable. At the same time, moments of national reckoning reveal a hunger for deeper understanding. When history is taught honestly, when suppressed stories are told, they often resonate across generations and communities. People recognize patterns they have lived with but lacked language to describe. Slavery becomes not a distant atrocity, but a key to understanding contemporary struggles over inequality, trust, and belonging. Art and storytelling have played a powerful role in this reckoning. Through film, literature, music, and visual art, creators have explored the emotional truths of slavery and its aftermath. These works challenge sanitized narratives and insist on empathy. They invite audiences to feel the weight of history, not as guilt, but as awareness. Awareness is the first step toward responsibility. Responsibility does not require collective shame, but it does require collective honesty. It asks the nation to acknowledge that its greatness and its cruelty were intertwined, that freedom and exploitation grew together. This acknowledgement does not diminish the country's achievements. It places them in context, allowing for a more mature and resilient national identity. The alternative is repetition. When history is denied or minimized, its patterns resurface. Inequality deepens, distrust grows. Conflict intensifies. Slavery's legacy is not dangerous because it is remembered. It is dangerous when it is ignored. Unexamined history has a way of asserting itself through crisis. As the United States moves forward, the challenge is not simply to remember slavery, but to understand how thoroughly it shaped the nation's structures and values. That understanding can inform choices about policy, education, and justice. It can guide efforts to repair harm rather than merely manage its symptoms. The story of slavery is not only a story of suffering, it is also a story of endurance, resistance, and unfinished struggle. Those who survived it, fought it, and lived in its aftermath shaped the nation in ways that are still unfolding. Their legacy is not only one of pain, but of persistence. How the United States responds to that legacy will determine whether slavery remains a silent architect of inequality or a lesson finally taken seriously enough to inspire lasting change at its core. The story of how slavery shaped the United States is a story about power, who holds it, who is denied it, and how it is justified across generations. Slavery created a blueprint for organizing society around hierarchy, control, and unequal worth. Even after the chains were legally removed, the blueprint remained, influencing laws, economies, cultural norms, and everyday interactions in ways that continue to shape American life. One of slavery's most enduring impacts lies in how race became tied to social status. Before slavery hardened into a racial system, differences among people were often defined by religion, nationality, or class. But over time, slavery transformed race into a rigid marker of inferiority and privilege. This racial hierarchy did not dissolve with emancipation. Instead, it became embedded in social expectations, shaping who was trusted, who was feared, who was believed, and who was ignored. These assumptions influenced science, medicine, and academia for generations. Biased research and pseudoscientific theories once attempted to legitimize racial inequality, reinforcing harmful stereotypes. Even as overtly racist science was discredited, subtler forms of bias persisted in research, healthcare, and education. Slavery's legacy thus extended into the very institutions meant to produce knowledge and truth. Politics, too, continued to carry slavery's imprint. Electoral strategies, district boundaries, and voting regulations often reflected fears of black political power that dated back to emancipation and earlier. Appeals to tradition, heritage, or cultural preservation sometimes masked efforts to maintain hierarchies first established under slavery. Political polarization over race, identity, and inequality often echoed arguments that once defended bondage, even when expressed in modern language. Slavery also shaped American capitalism in profound ways. The system demonstrated how immense wealth could be extracted through exploitation, normalizing the idea that profit could outweigh human dignity. This mindset did not vanish. It reappeared in labor practices, corporate behavior, and economic policies that prioritized growth over equity. While the targets of exploitation changed over time, the underlying logic remained disturbingly familiar. At the same time, the descendants of enslaved people continued to shape the nation's culture, politics, and moral direction. Music, language, cuisine, religious traditions, and artistic movements born from enslaved communities became defining elements of American identity. From spirituals to blues, from jazz to hip-hop, creative expression carried the memory of slavery while transforming pain into innovation and influence. The nation's cultural richness cannot be separated from the resilience of those who endured bondage. Social movements across generations drew strength from this history of endurance. The fight against slavery inspired later struggles for civil rights, labor protections, gender equality, and broader human rights. The methods of resistance refined by enslaved people and their allies, organizing, storytelling, moral persuasion, and collective action, became tools for confronting other forms of injustice. In this way, slavery shaped not only oppression, but also the traditions of resistance that challenge it. Still, the emotional weight of slavery remains difficult for many Americans to confront. It challenges comforting narratives about national innocence and uncomplicated progress. It raises questions about fairness, responsibility, and the meaning of justice across time. Some respond by denying its relevance, others by demanding reckoning. This tension reflects the unresolved nature of slavery's place in the national story. To fully understand how slavery shaped the United States, it is not enough to study dates, laws, or battles. It requires examining how everyday life has been structured by decisions made long ago. It means noticing how neighborhoods form, how schools are funded, how healthcare is distributed, how media portrays certain communities, and how political priorities are set. Slavery's influence is not always obvious, but it is deeply embedded. Yet embedded influence does not mean inevitable destiny. History shows that systems built by human hands can be changed by human choice. The same society that once normalized slavery has, at different moments, chosen expansion of rights, greater inclusion, and deeper accountability. Progress has been slow, uneven, and contested, but it has been real. The future of slavery's legacy depends on how consciously the nation chooses to respond to it. Will inequality rooted in history be accepted as natural or confronted as the result of identifiable choices? Will the stories of enslaved people be treated as side notes or as central chapters in the American narrative? Will memory be used to defend the status quo or to imagine something better? Slavery shaped the United States by defining its contradictions, fueling its growth, distorting its values, and testing its commitment to freedom. It left behind wounds that have not fully healed and lessons that have not fully been learned. But it also revealed the capacity for resistance, transformation, and moral awakening. The story does not end with slavery, and it does not end with its aftermath. It continues in every debate about equality, every struggle for justice, every effort to tell a more honest version of history. To understand the United States is to understand slavery's role in creating it. To shape the nation's future is to decide what will be done with that understanding. In recent years, the question of how to live with slavery's legacy has moved from the margins of academic debate into everyday public life. Conversations that once took place quietly in classrooms or scholarly journals now unfold in city councils, school boards, workplaces, and living rooms. This shift reflects a growing recognition that slavery is not simply history to be remembered, but a force that continues to shape present realities. One of the clearest signs of this shift is the renewed focus on historical truth. Archives have been reopened, records digitized, and forgotten stories brought back into view. Enslaved people who once appeared only as numbers or property listings are now recognized as individuals with names, families, skills, and inner lives. This recovery of humanity challenges older narratives that treated slavery as impersonal or inevitable. It makes the past harder to dismiss and harder to sanitize. Education has become a central battleground in this effort. What children are taught about slavery influences how they understand their country and their place within it. When slavery is presented as a minor flaw rather than a defining system, students inherit an incomplete understanding of inequality and injustice. When it is taught honestly, with attention to violence, resistance, and legacy, it provides tools for critical thinking and empathy. These debates are not only about the past, they are about shaping future citizens. Public institutions have also begun to reckon with their own histories. Universities, churches, corporations, and governments have traced their origins and growth back to enslaved labor and slave-derived wealth. Some have issued apologies or acknowledgements. Others have funded research, memorials, or community programs. These efforts are often contested, criticized as insufficient or symbolic, yet they mark a departure from earlier eras of silence and denial. Memory has taken physical form in new ways. Memorials dedicated to enslaved people now stand where they were once bought, sold, or exploited. These spaces invite reflection rather than celebration. They ask visitors to confront suffering that was long ignored and to consider how public space reflects collective values. The presence of these memorials signals a shift in whose lives are deemed worthy of remembrance. At the same time, backlash has been intense. Efforts to confront slavery's legacy are often framed as divisive, unpatriotic, or unnecessary. Critics argue that focusing on past injustice undermines national unity. This reaction reveals how deeply slavery shaped American identity. For many, acknowledging its influence feels like a threat to belonging itself. The struggle over memory is also a struggle over power and narrative. Yet history suggests that avoiding discomfort has never led to genuine unity. Slavery endured precisely because it was normalized, rationalized, and hidden behind comforting myths. Progress has come when those myths were challenged, when injustice was named, and when people demanded change despite resistance. The discomfort of reckoning is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that something long buried is finally being examined. The legacy of slavery also raises questions about repair. What does justice look like when harm spans generations? There is no single answer, but the question itself reflects a shift in moral imagination. It acknowledges that freedom without repair left wounds unaddressed and inequalities entrenched. Whether through policy, investment, or truth-telling, the search for repair reflects an understanding that history created the present, and that the present can reshape the future. Slavery shaped the United States by teaching it what could be taken without consequence. Reckoning with that legacy asks the nation to decide what it now owes, not out of guilt, but out of responsibility. That decision remains unfinished, and its outcome will shape generations to come. The influence of slavery is also evident in how Americans experience trust, or the lack of it, within institutions and across communities. Trust is built when systems consistently protect people's rights and dignity. Slavery did the opposite. It taught generations that the law could be a tool of oppression, that authority could be cruel, and that justice could be selective. Those lessons did not vanish with emancipation. They were reinforced through segregation, exclusion, and unequal enforcement. This history helps explain why skepticism toward institutions remains strong in communities most affected by slavery's aftermath. When promises of protection were repeatedly broken, trust became a risk rather than a default. Survival required caution, self-reliance, and community solidarity. These traits, often misunderstood or mischaracterized, are legacies of adaptation to systems that were never designed to serve everyone equally. Slavery also shaped emotional norms. Expressions of vulnerability were dangerous under bondage. Strength, endurance, and control became necessary for survival. These traits were passed down, sometimes misread as detachment or defiance. In reality, they reflect generations of learning how to endure injustice without surrendering identity. The emotional legacy of slavery lies in how people cope, communicate, and protect themselves. National conversations about unity often overlook these realities. Calls for reconciliation without acknowledgement of harm place the burden on those already injured. Slavery taught the nation how to move forward without repair, how to declare closure without justice. That pattern has repeated itself across eras, leaving wounds unhealed and tensions unresolved. Understanding this context changes how conflict is interpreted. Protests, demands for reform, and challenges to authority are often framed as disruptions. Seen through the lens of history, they are continuations of a long struggle for recognition and protection. Slavery shaped the conditions that made such struggles necessary. It also shaped the strategies used to pursue change. The media plays a powerful role in this dynamic. Narratives about crime, protest, and social unrest are often stripped of historical context, reinforcing stereotypes rooted in slavery-era thinking. When behavior is judged without understanding the systems that shaped it, blame is misplaced and solutions remain shallow. Slavery's legacy persists not only in policy, but in perception. Yet there are also moments of connection that suggest another path. When history is shared openly, it can create understanding rather than division. Listening to stories of enslavement, survival, and resistance humanizes experiences that were long abstracted or ignored. These moments do not erase disagreement, but they can build empathy, which slavery worked systematically to destroy. Slavery shaped the United States by fracturing trust and normalizing inequality. Repairing that damage requires more than reforms on paper. It requires rebuilding relationships between people and institutions, between communities, and between the past and the present. That work is slow, complex, and deeply human. The measure of progress will not be whether slavery is forgotten, but whether its lessons are finally taken seriously enough to change how power is exercised and how dignity is protected. Looking forward, the most important question may be how consciously the United States chooses to carry its history. Slavery shaped the nation, whether it is acknowledged or not. The difference lies in whether that influence remains invisible and unexamined, or whether it is understood and challenged. History does not dictate the future, but it sets the conditions under which choices are made. A more honest relationship with the past offers clarity. It explains why inequality persists despite formal equality. It reveals why certain conflicts recur across generations. It helps distinguish between problems caused by individual actions and those produced by systems designed long ago. Without this clarity, solutions remain partial and fragile. Slavery also offers a warning. It demonstrates how easily ideals can coexist with injustice, how progress can be built on exploitation, and how power can be protected through denial. These patterns are not confined to the past. They reappear whenever growth is prioritized over dignity, whenever voices are excluded from decision-making, whenever inequality is treated as natural. At the same time, slavery's history offers evidence of transformation. It shows how resistance can grow under the harshest conditions, how culture can survive attempts at erasure, and how moral arguments can eventually reshape law and society. The end of slavery itself, however incomplete its aftermath, stands as proof that entrenched systems can be dismantled. The future will be shaped by which parts of this history are emphasized. If slavery is remembered only as tragedy, it risks becoming paralyzing. If it is remembered only as resolved, it becomes irrelevant. But if it is understood as both foundational and unfinished, it becomes instructive. It can guide choices about equity, justice, and belonging. Slavery shaped the United States by forcing it to confront its deepest contradictions. Those contradictions remain, but they are not immutable. Each generation inherits not only the consequences of the past, but the responsibility to decide what to do with them. Silence is a choice. Denial is a choice. Engagement is also a choice. The story of slavery is not separate from the story of America. It is woven into its economy, its politics, its culture, and its sense of self. To understand the nation is to understand that connection. To change the nation is to reckon with it honestly. In the end, how slavery shaped the United States is not just a question about history. It is a question about values. It asks whether freedom will remain selective or become universal, whether memory will serve comfort or truth, and whether the nation will continue to be shaped by its past or finally begin to shape its future with intention. That question remains open. And the answer is still being written.